This is the Southeastern North Carolina Radio Reading Service, a United Way partner agency. We welcome you to this program entitled Off the Bookshelf. Your reader is Nehemiah Subaru, and I will be reading Slavery by Another Name, written by Douglas A. Blackmon. After the war progressed, ever large numbers of local men from near the Cunningham farm left off battle duty. Two of Elijah's sons fought for the Confederacy, Moses and Jane, both husband and father. These saw gruesome action, personal injury, and capture by the Union. Elijah's grandson Oliver, too young to fight with the troops, joined the Home Guard and ragtag platoons of old men and teenagers whose job was to patrol the road for deserters, fleeing slaves, and Union scouts. In the beginning, large groups gathered at the store in the crossroads settlement of 6 Mile to send them off. The group of women worked together to sew the uniforms they wore. Soldiers on the move through the area were at a regular site, crossing the Chashaba on the ferry near the mouth of Cunningham Creek, and traversing the main road from there towards the rail town to the east. Confederate soldiers camped often on the Cunningham farm, stretching out in the big field near the river, foraging from the plantation supplies and food, exchanging spent horses for fresh ones. At one point late in the war, an entire regiment set camp in the field, erecting tents and lighting cook fires. The appearance of the Confederate soldiers must have been an extraordinary event in the lives of the black members of the Cunningham clan. The war years were a conflicted period of confused roles for slaves. They were the subject of the Union's Army of Liberation and the victim of South's economic system. Yet at the same time, slaves were also servants and protectors of their white masters. In the woods near the Cunningham home, slaves guarded the horses and possessions of their white owners, hidden there to avoid raids of northern soldiers. Some slaves took the opportunity to flee. Most stayed at their post until true liberation came in the spring of 1865. The foundry and arsenal at Selma and the simple mine and furnaces around the Cunningham farm that supplied it with raw material had taken on outsized importance as the war dragged on. The Alabama manufacturing network became the backbone of the Confederacy's ability to make arms. At the Tenderer factories were depleted of raw material and skilled workers and menaced by the advancing armies of the Ulysses S. Grant. Preservation of the Alabama enterprise was the key element of a last-ditch plan by Jefferson Davis, the Southern president, to retreat with whatever was left of the Confederate military into the Deep South and continue the war. For more than a year, Union forces in southern Tennessee and northern Alabama massed for an anticipated order to obliterate any continued capacity of a wrong Confederate government to make arms. A small group of horse soldiers made regular probing raid against minimal Southern resistance. In April of 1864, Alabama's governor wired Confederate Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, commander of rebel forces in Alabama and Mississippi, imploring him to send additional troops. The enemy's forces are fortifying their positions with their cavalry raiding over the country. It is certain that the forces will work way south and destroy the valuable work in central Alabama. Can nothing be done? Finally, in March 1865, a mass of 13,500 Union cavalrymen swept down from the Tennessee border in one of the North Potomac death blows to the rebellion. Commanded by General James S. Wilson, the Union Army were drilled and amply armed. splitting into three raiding parties, each assigned to destroy key elements of Alabama's industrial infrastructure. Moving unchallenged for days, the Federal troops burned or erected iron forges, mills, and massive stockpiles of cotton and coal at Red Mountain, Iredell, and Helen, north of Bibb County. On the morning of March 30th, Union soldiers slowed down the rain-drenched road into Columbia, destroying the machinery of the Shelby Iron Works, shoving its equipment into local wells and streams, and freeing the slaves critical to its operation. Against nearly hopeless odds, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former slave dealer who had become the South's most storied horseman, met the Blue advance at a point south of the town of Metabola, skirmishing along the Maha Creek, just miles from the county of Forrest's disorganized command could only harass Wilson's advance. Northern troops took the Brearfield Furnace on March 31st and left it in ruins, outmanned and outfought, with flooding creeks blocking his maneuver. Forrest himself, slashed by a saber in savage fighting on April 1st, retreated for a final stand at Selma. The next day, Wilson's troops charged the fortified industrial complex in Selma and routed Forrest's remaining 4,000 men. The Confederate general slipped away with an escort of 100 soldiers, massacring as he made his escape. Most of a continuing contingent of 25 sleeping Union scouts he stumbled upon in the field. Confederate forces captured nearly 3,000 of Forrest's men, along with more than 60 pieces of field cannon, score of heavily artillery guns, and 9 factories, 5 major iron forges, 3 foundries, 20 locomotives, immense quantities of military supply, and 35,000 bales of cotton. The arsenal, factory, shop, and foundries at Selma were systematically destroyed, perhaps most shockingly to the local white, before moving on to attack Georgia. Wilson's officers quickly raised a 1,000-man regiment of black troops placed under the command of the 3rd Ohio Cavalry, with the remaining Confederate Army commanded by General Robert E. Lee and General Joseph E. Johnston unable to unite. Jefferson Davis hoped to continue the rebellion as the guerrilla struggle collapsed. Cut off from his remaining troops, his Alabama munition system destroyed, deprived of the last region of relative security in the South, he attempted to flee to Texas or Mexico. On the hot pursuit of the detachment of General Wilson's troop, he was captured by Union forces in Georgia weeks later. The war finally came to its end. Alabama has suffered losses totaling $500 million, and some beyond comprehension in 1865. The total value of foreign property was reduced during the war from $250 million to less than $98 million, including the loss of slaves. All based in the state had collapsed. Agricultural production level would not match that of 1860 for another 40 years. But the final days of the war provided to be only the beginning of more exorable anarchic struggle. A vicious white insurgency against the Union occupation and the specter of black citizenship began to take shape, presaged by the conduct of Home Guard patrol like the one Oliver Cunningham had joined. The patrol, uncoordinated and increasingly contentious of any authority during the war, had come to be known more as bandits and thugs than defenders of the Confederacy. After 4 years of conscription verging on kidnapping, violence perpetrated against critics of rebellion, and ruthless seizure of supply and property. The Home Guard was in many places as despised as the Yankee troops. But in the aftermath of a sudden, and in much of the South unanticipated surrender, no clear central authority existed in the domestic affair of places too small or remote to warrant a detachment of Northern troops. In the Deep South, that meant nearly every place outside state capitals and economic centers. The result in the 2-year proceedings, Henry and Mary's wedding, was a spreading wave of internecine violence and thievery by returning Confederate soldiers, particularly against those Southerners who had doubted the war. Deserters who had been far more numerous than Southern mythology acknowledged began settling old scores. The increasing lawlessness of the post-war years was, rather than a wave of crime by free slaves as so often claimed, largely perpetrated against the whites by other whites. The Cunningham farm sat in the middle of this unrest. One gang of deserters in Bibb County, made up of men believed to have abandoned the armies of both the North and the South, called themselves the Uglies, and martyred through the countryside during the war, robbing farms and threatening Confederate supporters. Among gangs, another gang inhabited the Yellow Leaf Swamp on the border with adjoining Clinton County. A proper military band of men near the town of Metovolo, calling itself Blackwell's Cavalry, hunted the countryside for Confederate deserters before the Southern surrendered and continued as an outlaw gang after the war. The group eventually murdered a total of 17 local men. White lawlessness was so rampant in Shelby County that less than a year before Henry and Mary's wedding, Union military officials in Alabama capital threatened to send troops into the area to restore peace. Clinton County had been a hotbed of such guerrilla activity throughout the war, and emerged as a refuge for Confederate deserters and Southerners who remained loyal to the Union. A local plantation owner, Captain James Cobb, who had been sent home from duty with the Southern armies due to poor health, was assigned to the task of breaking up the gangs of deserters. The efforts spawned vendettas that would outlast the war. On June 3rd, 1865, nearly 2 months after the surrender, Cobb was seized by a group of 30 white and hanged from a tree on his property. Afterwards, they ransacked his home, killing or stealing his livestock. The former Confederate officer was accused of having named 7 of the mob's members as deserters. The Blackwell's group subsequently captured the 7 and summarily executed them. Of the handful of Union soldiers sent by Bibb County to oversee the nominal local court system during the first 2 years after the war, one was killed at a Centerville Street corner by the Confederate veteran William and Axe Handle. 2 agents of the Freedmen Bureau were assigned to the area in January and February of 1866. The man named Beard and Higginbotham were promptly whipped by local whites and driven from the county. Not long after, rumors spread that the 2 former slaves named Tom Johnson and Jude Russell had been seen around the county sporting the fine clothes paid for by Freedmen Bureau agency. The emancipated slaves planned to live like white folks and marry white wives, according to a newspaper account. Johnson was promptly hanged from a tree on Market Street. A few mornings later, passers-by found Russell dangling dead in a tree not far from the scene of the early lynching. earlier lynching. Yet, even as Southern whites like those in Bibb County made their rejection of the new order so apparent, no alternatives was clear either. The loss of slaves left white farm families such as the Cunningham, and even more so those on expansion plantations with score of hundreds of slaves, not just financially but intellectually perfect. The slaves were the true experts in the task of the cotton production on most farms. In many cases, it was slaves who directed the gains of other slaves in their daily work. Slavery had been introduced into the southern colonies in the 1600s, with the argument that whites operating alone were incapable of large-scale cotton production. The concept of sharecropping and foreign tenacities hadn't yet evolved. The notions that their farms could be operated in some manner other than with the groups of black laborers compelled by a landowner or his overseers to work as many as 20 hours a day was antithetical to most whites. Moreover, the southern willingness of millions of black laborers to insulenting demand cash wages and other requirements to secure their labor was an almost otherworldly experience for whites such as Eliza Cunningham. Former slaves were suddenly mobile to seeking new lodging away from farms and their slave lives and attempting to put white farmers into competition with one another for their works. In the absence of any means to supply free slaves with land, the Freedmen Bureau and Northern military commanders stationed in the South encouraged blacks to enter into labor contracts with whites. The result were written agreements between white and black farm hands filled by provision aimed at restoring the subjugated state of African Americans. One agent of the Freedmen Bureau wrote that white men were unable to fathom that work could be accomplished without some prodigious bidding and obligating of hireling to the employer. Some white plantation owners attempted to cohere their former slaves into signing lifetime contracts to work on the farm. In one South Carolina case in 1865, when 4 freedmen refused such agreement, they were killed, and a third, a woman, was tortured. More common were year-to-year contracts that obligated black workers to remain throughout a planting and harvest season to receive their full payment, and under which they agreed to extraordinarily onerous limitations on personal freedom that echoed slave laws in effect before emancipation. They agreed not to leave the landowner's property without a written pass, not to own firearms, to obey all commands of their farmer or his overseer, to seek in a servile manner, and in the event of a violation of rule, to accept whatever punishment the farmer deemed appropriate, often the lash. Most of the early contracts adopted in the South in 1865 and 1866 were dissolved by commanders of the occupying Union troops, but they framed a strategy that Southern whites would return to again and again. When Eliza's son arrived home from the war, they found only the bareness gleaming of the earlier times with which to restart their lives. The thriving farmland world of their boyhood no longer existed. After 4 years of steadily inflated Confederate script, now entirely worthless, the value of a man's land and tools, even of a bale of cotton, was nearly unknowable. Eliza's property was worth the sustainable sum of nearly $20,000 before the war. The great bulk of that was invested in his slaves, and now they were his no more. The Cunningham had not even the cash to buy cotton seeds and corn, much less the labor of the former slave they had so recently owned. In February 1868, Eliza, perhaps sensing his own mortality more acutely in the post-war chaos, began dividing much of the plantation among his four sons, James, John, Moses, and Harry. At the same time, his daughter, Rebecca Battle, bought 200 acres of property for $600. Later that month, Moses Cunningham bought $120 from a cotton buyer in the town of Randolph. An outpost in the other end of the county, on the end of the wide open cotton land of southern Alabama. For collateral, Moses promised 2,500 pounds bale of cotton at the end of the season. From another man, he borrowed $120, securing that note with one 6-year-old mule and 10-year-old horse. The following January 1869, Moses borrowed again, mortgaging for 150 of his older horses and other 3 mules. The crop that had fallen wouldn't be enough to pay off the loan, and Moses couldn't clear his debt until 1871. A sense of perilous was pervasive among white. Eliza Bishop, a prosperous farmer with a spread of several hundred acres under plow, and another rich Ben Chabah downstream from the Cunningham, was in similar straits in the fall of 1869. Bishop, Southeast born, and another of the county's earliest settlers borrowed a little more than $50 against 100 bushels of corn, and mortgaged a portion of his land for $37.60. He never paid it back, however. The next summer, his wife, Sarah Bishop, borrowed $150 against 2 bales of cotton from John C. Hendry. The cotton buyer at Randolph had become the county's de facto banker and financer. She settled the debt after the harvest of 1870, but immediately had to assume another loan. The bishops let Eliza and his family, were devoted Wesleyan Methodists. Along with their slave, the bishop had attended the Mount Zion church near their farm in the south end of the county, where the family lived in a house overflowing with daughters. The Bishop and Cunningham, white and black, would have known each other well through the close-knitted circle of the Methodist circuit. John Wesley Starr, a circuit-riding clergyman, was a regular feature before both congregations. Eliza Bishop had accumulated an even more impressive collection of slaves than Eliza, with 10 black men and 3 black women old enough to work in the field at the beginning of the war. A half dozen young children rounded out the slave quarter. On the day of emancipation in 1863, the bishop's slave girl named Mary, who 5 years later would become Henry Cunningham's wife, was 14. In the wake of the war, one episode in the lives of White Cunningham became the defining antidote of the family's suffering and resurrection. Eliza's son Moses, who had migrated in Bentonville, Paris, Louisiana, a few years before succession, lost his land and the life of his wife, and had been forced to send his children on a harrowing journey through the battle zone of Mississippi with only a slave and Gentry preacher to protect them. The saga resonated through generations of white Cunningham and black descendants from their slaves. After Moses enlisted in 1867, his pregnant wife Nancy Catherine grew ill, then died during childbirth. Moses returned home from the front to bury Nancy and make arrangements for their 6 surviving children. Elijah Cunningham sent a Baptist minister to Louisiana to bring his grandchildren back to Alabama for the duration of the war. With the Southern Railroad system already in shambles and most trains impressed into military service, the preacher and one of Moses' 2 slaves, Joey, set out on a out-drag wagon. That was the hardest trail I had ever had to go through, and to leave my children to be carried off to Alabama. Moses recounted to descendants years later. For 3 weeks, the odd expedition inched around the war disrupted South. The preacher and the old African-American a scramble of Southern foraging for turnips and cornmeal. The oldest daughter, Senina, still a child herself, feeding 2-month-old Johnny, the infant whose birth had killed her mother, with a gruel of baked sweet potatoes. In November 1867, the ragged band arrived at Elijah Cunningham farm on the Chaba River. The fate of Moses, still at war, was unknown. We never knew whether he was dead or alive till one day, after the war was over, we saw him coming. Serena later wrote, Moses started over, resettling on a nearby land among Copperas Creek, marrying the daughter of another former slaveholding family, and begetting another 7 children. The losses suffered by Moses and the slow rescue of his family in the heart of the war could be as parable for how white Southerners perceived the destruction of the South they had known. Physical and financial devastation, death, and grief, followed by a transforming struggle to survive and rebuild. But the story was also underscored in the terrifying vulnerability whites like Cunningham discovered in being forced to place the fate and future of Moses' family in the hands of the descendants of Africa. After the war, as Cunningham slaves brazenly asserted their independence, the journey of Joe and the children across the South came to symbolize the reliance on blacks that Southern whites could never again allow. Regardless of their entwined past, the rehabilitation of the South by whites would not just purposefully include black. As time passed and opportunity permitted, former slaves would be compelled to perform the rebuilding of the South as well, in a system of labor hardening distinguishable in its brutality from the old slavery that preceded it. If one look out from Elijah's porch in December 1868 across the crop road and down past the creek, the only green in a nearly colorless winter landscape was in the short, scruffy needles of twisted cheddars he had planted long ago along the wagon drive from road to the house. The slaves' cabin, nearly 24 of them, were mostly empty now. Even Cisco, the old man slave who had worked Elijah's farm nearly as long as the white master himself, was gone down the road. Already, weather and uselessness were down we're doing the shack's end. Chris Brown lays heaped at the feet of a line of high pine and bare hickories that frame the boundaries of the main field between the river and the house. The wall of yellow limestone rising up abruptly from the eastern banks of the Chaba looked pale and gray. The big field long devoid of its hardwood forest was stripped with lifeless row of cotton stalks and corn husks standing against the low, sharp angle rays of winter sun. In every direction, thousands of bedraggled slips of lint still clung to broken cotton boll, wisps of that portion of the harvest that time and weather. And in Eliza's mind, the obstinacy of his Negroes had conspired to leave behind. All winter long, they would hang their limbs and wet, layering the dead field with a hazing whisper of white and goading Eliza's Cottingham in their waist.